Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast.
A lot of the fresh turkey we have at Christmas was killed in June, but has been sitting there at 0.5 degree ever since. So it's not frozen.
In this lesson, we will be looking at the first key area of Unit 3, focusing on food security and sustainable food production. And we're lucky to be joined by two of the nation's leading experts in this area. I will be chatting with Ritchie, a farmer with interest in food policy from the Borders, and Dr. Fiona Borthwick, who runs the Master's course on food security at the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security at Edinburgh University. We'll also discover why our Christmas turkey may have been killed in June and why we should all be eating more potatoes. Throughout the lesson, we'll be referring to the SQA curriculum for higher biology and helping you understand a little bit more about the key area. Hi, Pete.
Hello, Paul. Hi, nice to be here.
We were slightly delayed. We're obviously recording this during the coronavirus lockdown. It was a wee incident on the farm, was it?
Yeah, just as I was about to sort of prep for this, Paul, I got a phone call saying your cows are on the road, and that always strikes dread into your heart. And then I thought, well, it's all right, it's locked down, it'll be quiet, we'll just go and round them up quietly. But of course, there's been a bit of activity on the road lately and a lot of farm vehicles and stuff. So you've always got to worry a bit that they're going to cause an accident. Anyway, they're out there, they're milling about in the hedge between the field and the road because they suddenly managed to break themselves in there. They've had like 30 acres of grass to eat for the last sort of week, but for some reason they decided where they really wanted to be was halfway between the hedge and the road, and one of the little ones had got themselves stuck and couldn't quite get turned around. So that was a few minutes getting them out of there, and now I've put them onto the best field, and hopefully they'll be quiet for an hour when I do this, and I can go back and move them back to where they're supposed to be. But cows they are curious, and they're also real creatures of habit. So because they came in one way, they wanted to go back the way they came in. And I was telling them, no, there's another way out this way. And they didn't believe me. It's like, no, we know the way out. And I'm going, no, I know the way out. And so we had a bit of a to and fro with the cows, but they're all safely home now. So that's good.
Well, as long as they're nice and safe. I guess the grass is always greener on the other side.
Absolutely, they do. They look over the fence and they think, I could get a bit of that. They really do.
Now that Pete's cows are safely off the road, we can get started with this week's lesson. An increase in human population and a concern for food security leads to demand for increased food production. Dr. Fiona Borthwick from Edinburgh University explained exactly what food security was.
Yes, so we have a sort of a clear definition of food security, and that was agreed in around about the 1990s, and it was accepted by the UN. And that is the classic definition is all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life.
It is worth pointing out that the SQA definition of food security is the ability of human populations to access food of sufficient quality and quantity.
It seems quite straightforward in a way, but actually when you then start to break it apart, it's incredibly complex. And the way that we often view food security is through what we call dimensions, and we split this complex interaction of different agricultural, social, economic issues up into 4 dimensions. And the first one that we talk about is access. So access to food. And that means the type of food that is grown and how it is produced. And then after that, we think about availability. So how does an individual or a household get food? But then there are also other things around utilization. So do people learn how to cook food? And there are also cultural dimensions within that as well. So food is a really important part of culture, and it can be associated with religion, and there can be different rules that dictate the kind of preferences that a household will have in terms of the food that they want to eat and want to utilize. So that all comes into utilization. So in school, do people get taught to cook, and do they get taught the basics of food hygiene? And you can also think about that in terms of, say, gender. So in many cultures, it's usually assumed that the women will be the ones that plan the meals and learn how to cook. And then if a woman in a household becomes ill or can't fulfill that role, what happens if the men in that culture don't know how to cook? So there's so many different dynamics at play with even just that one part of food security.
The idea of food security isn't actually something that affects countries. It's something that affects families.
No, absolutely. And that kind of leads on to the next dimension, the fourth dimension, which is stability. So having, through a growing season, through a year, having a stable supply of food. There aren't lean periods where you can't access food, and prices of food don't go up and down significantly, so that it becomes harder to afford food.
Now we have a better understanding of food security, let's go back to Pete and find out a little bit more about his farm and food production.
Well, we're an upland farm. In other words, we start at about 900 feet, which doesn't sound very high, but it's about the height of Arthur's Seat, if you know Edinburgh. And then the farm goes up from there. So it's cold, and it's on a north-facing slope. So although we do grow some veg, that's always a bit of a struggle to get a good crop of veg. And we grow quite a lot in the polytunnels. So we mostly have cows and sheep. We used to have pigs, and we used to have chickens for eggs. And that's another story when it comes to food security. But we've given that up, and we're just concentrating on cows and sheep now because they basically are easier to manage most days, and they just eat the grass and get on with it, So
apart from when they're defying lockdown,
absolutely.
And chicken, of course, that's our favourite meat in Scotland, is my understanding. And there was a fascinating story that I heard recently about actually the history of chickens and how we've got to producing chickens, which started with a Delaware housewife in America called Celia Steele. I'm not sure if you're aware of that story, but back in, I think it was 1923, she ordered, I think it was like 50 chicks for her house, because a bit almost like yourself, you used to obviously keep chickens for eggs and maybe put the occasional one in the cooker for dinner. And she had ordered 50 chicks for their household. And I guess back in the 1920s, that was very much the norm, that people would maybe have their house, they'd maybe keep a few animals to bring in their own food. But whatever happened when Mrs. Steele ordered her 50 chicks, she was somehow sent 500 by accident, and decided at the time that she would keep those, raised them, made a vast profit, and went back and ordered 1,000. And a couple of years later, she had almost 10,000 chickens. And that I guess appears to maybe be the start of the mass production of animals, which is a huge issue this now, and that obviously won't be the type of food production that will happen on your own farm.
No, although we did try raising chickens for a while, but it's a lovely story, and what happened after that was that they found out, of course, that chickens didn't do very well if they kept them inside, because there's no vitamin D when you're inside. So that's part of the whole story about understanding vitamins and the role of vitamins in diet, which we were still figuring out in the 1920s, and was about adding vitamin D to diets. And now if you buy chicken food, you'll find it's got so many milligrams per kilogram of vitamin D in it, because unfortunately we still keep nearly all our chickens that we eat for meat inside. And the other thing that's happened since Mrs. Steele's time was that the breeding of chickens has become an extraordinary science. So we used to have chickens, and they laid eggs, and when they finished laying eggs, you roasted them and put them in a pot and ate them, and they were a bit stringy but very tasty. Now the hens that lay eggs and the hens that we put in the pot are completely different. They're different size, they have different body shapes, they have different metabolism, and we've bred the hens we put in the pot now to be ready in 38 days. So from start to finish, a bird takes 38 days for its life, whereas our laying hens are bred to produce 320 eggs in one season, whereas a bird in the wild, a chicken in the wild, would lay maybe 8 or 10. So we've bred animals to be these incredibly high performing bits of our food system, but the downside of that obviously is that they spend pretty much all their lives in sheds, unless there are some production systems where chickens really get to be outside, but even free range is no guarantee of that. Most free range hens spend pretty much all their time inside in a shed. So,
which is quite a sad thought, and I never quite understood the sheer scale and the size of that industry. And before I became a biology teacher, I was involved with some scientific and medical conferences, and I remember being told about one conference that we were organising that was coming to Glasgow at the time, and I was told that we would be working with the ESPN conference. Now at the time, I get quite excited. I thought, excellent. I really enjoy watching ESPN. I'm big into sports. And very quickly realised that, of course, ESPN stood for the European Society of Poultry Nutrition. So it wasn't quite the conference that I expected, but it was fascinating. There were people from all across Europe and around the planet that came to Glasgow that year and discussed for a number of days in great detail how to feed chickens and how to grow chickens in 38 days, as you say, in order to just deliver on the sheer demand for chickens, which when you think about it, and the human population, is just an extraordinary industry, really, to appreciate the size of that.
It is extraordinary. Yep. I don't know how many. I lose sight of the billions and millions, but I think it's something like 78 billion chickens a year we get through on the planet. I mean, it is
78 billion chickens.
It's in that ballpark. It's a lot more, many more chickens than people on the planet, and I think chickens make up something like 98% of the bird biomass on the planet too. You count all the penguins and all the eagles and all the blue tits and the chaffinches and the crows and all of that. 98% or something of that is chicken. So we've sort of we've gone a long way down that road. Says Mrs. Steele.
We all grow up with books and stories about farms, and we have, I guess, a picture through that of what we believe farms are like. But I guess in a lot of senses, on a kind of global, especially on a mass production scale, the reality of that's very different.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place to start with this sort of conversation about food security, because, and I suppose in terms of one or two of the key messages I wanted to get across to people, the first thing is about since the Second World War, the whole world we'd already moved towards some industrialized agriculture in Scotland and the rest of the UK, but in that period, a lot of the rest of the world has also moved towards this big scale industrialized agricultural system, and a lot of that's been built around the narrative that we have to feed the world. We have a growing population, we have to feed the world, and the imperative is to increase production at all costs. And that's still very much, I think, how a lot of people understand the food situation in the world, that there's a growing population, we have to pull out all the stops, we have to produce as much food as we can. The truth is that, the technical challenge of feeding the world was met, many years ago. There's not a technical challenge to feed the world an adequate diet. And even in the period when the population of the world was growing much more quickly than it is now, so in the 60s and 70s, when it was growing at around 3% a year, food production more than kept pace with population growth. And some of that was because we took extra land into production. A lot of it was because we put extra fertilizer on the ground. And some of it was to do with, as we're talking about with chickens, to do with improved genetics, the wheat breeding program, but also the animal breeding programs with chickens and pigs. So the sort of combination of more land, more fertilizer, more inputs, and better genetics, better breeding, all meant that we could easily keep pace with population growth. And now, the problem isn't, and hasn't been for a while, physically creating enough food to feed everybody. The problem is making sure that everybody has access to that food. And so we live in a world where we still have 10% of the population undernourished. despite the fact there's more than enough food in the world for everybody.
It reminds me of something that I think it was Gandhi once said, that the earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. I guess by the sounds of it, he was probably right then.
Yeah, I think there is a strong argument to say that on the face of it, we do produce enough food, and it is a supply issue. And I think that is a good argument to make, because we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're also in the middle of the obesity pandemic as well. And we're seeing a really, really worrying rise in obesity, which is associated with lots of non-communicable diseases. So diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and certain forms of cancer. And it also exacerbates underlying health problems. So that shows that a really, really large proportion of people globally are consuming more food than they need to. But we can't really sort of point the finger at individuals. It's a symptom that the food supply chains are perhaps not serving people as they should be. I think that we also need to be careful that by saying we produce enough food already, we're avoiding the big issue of inequality. So we are producing that food, but we're producing it in areas where people who are vulnerable, who don't have the economic or the political power to access that food, they still need to be able to develop really resilient food systems. And when I say resilient food systems, I mean food systems that get food from the farm to the fork in a situation like COVID-19, or in a situation which we're going to be facing in the next decades, where the climate is changing and we're going to have disruptions to harvests and disruptions to food production. So we need to invest in those areas where people currently aren't able to access that safe food and enough of it. So a lot of food security concerns, food insecurity occurs in sub-Saharan African states. There is a huge amount of agricultural production coming out of Africa, but there are countries especially that have been through protracted conflict. So South Sudan, for example, Somalia, where we need to help to provide the skills and the resources to create sustainable food systems. One of the biggest total volume of food insecure people is in Southeast Asia. Because the population in that region is so big, and there is quite a high level of malnutrition and micronutrient nutrition in that region. So again, there's a lot of food that's produced in that region, but it's how it's distributed and how we look at equality. And that's why food security is so complicated, because it involves things like equality, and how do we approach this idea that there is a universal right to food. Does that mean that we have a sort of a universal credit system where everybody has the right to a certain number of calories a day? So it's not simply about having a food system that takes food from a farmer to a supermarket and then ultimately to your plate.
We've got to remember that the big growth in chicken consumption and pork consumption in the world, has been possible because we produce far more cereals than humans can eat. So the reason we feed half our grain harvest to animals is because we can produce that amount of grain. If we didn't feed it to animals, we'd have so much more grain than we could possibly eat.
From a farming point of view, it's obviously much more efficient to produce plant crops than it is to produce animal crops.
If you want to feed people, absolutely. And even the most efficient converters of human edible food into other forms of human edible food are chicken and salmon. But even for every 4 units of human edible protein you put into a chicken, you get 1 out. And it's pretty much the same with salmon, and the same with carbohydrates, with calories. For every 3 or 4 human edible calories you put in, and that's usually wheat or some other cereal, you get one out.
My understanding is that the Earth possesses at least 75,000 species of edible plants. And as humans, we really depend on a very, very small number of them to produce about 90 plus 95% of the world's food supply.
That's right, because it works very well for these bigger businesses that consolidate commodities to work with a smaller number of very predictable commodities that we know how to grow them at huge scale. And we're just on the call this morning with some colleagues in India who were talking about some work they were doing in and around their cities to try to preserve some of the dietary diversity that is much more traditional. It's still there in India, and saying we're losing it here too. People are eating a narrow range of plants, and they're working very hard to try and retain that, because it's good for our health, but it's also an important part of our heritage and our biology and our landscapes that we have this diversity. And it is worrying that we've narrowed down on so few crops for our diet.
Within the food supply and productivity key areas, we look at food chains and energy loss from a biological point of view. We look at the fact that obviously most of the energy gained by a consumer from its food is used for movement, etc. And therefore much of that energy is taken in by an organism and released as a result. So only about 10% of the total energy goes to the next level in the food chain, which means that if we are eating more fruit and vegetables rather than meat, then that is a far more efficient system in terms of energy and in terms, I guess, then of production as well.
I think it's a really good point. So certainly, you lose energy if you feed crops to animals, and then then you eat the animals. In terms of energy, you use a lot of energy in processing food. So if you take a loaf of bread, a standard loaf of bread, at the moment in industrial bread making, we put an enormous amount of energy into mixing up the dough, because we have a system for producing white bread or the bulk of our bread that called the Shorley Wood process, which uses huge amounts of energy to get air into dough as quickly as possible to speed up the bread making process. And then we create bread through that, which actually, to be quite honest, is not terribly good for our digestive system. And a lot of people have problems with bread because of that, because the way it's produced, but it's produced to fit a long food chain. So it's produced so that it doesn't go stale quickly. So that's why a loaf of white sliced bread will, you can put it in your fridge, you can put it in your cupboard, and basically you can eat it all week, and it still is much the same. It hasn't really changed very much. It takes quite a lot to make it go stale. Whereas if you bake a loaf of bread at home, or you buy a loaf of bread from a small bakery, you'll find that it, goes stale in a couple of days. And whereas in France and Italy, people respond to that by buying their bread every day. How we respond to it in the UK is we re-engineer the bread to make it last a week. But going back to your energy point, when you look at the footprint of that loaf, a huge amount of the energy went into the making of the bread, not even, getting it to farm gate. Whereas if you use sort of slower ways of, letting the bread rise with sourdough, the bugs do all the work. We're not using any electrical energy to put into that. But yeah, you're right. One of the most efficient ways of eating is to grow potatoes. Because basically you put them in the ground. 4 months later, for one potato you've got 20, and you can put those straight in the pot and eat them.
I do love a potato. What's your favourite type of potato, Pete?
Yeah, I love the red ones. We've got a variety called Satanta, which we're selling in the shop at the moment. It's really nice. It's lovely, and you can use the little ones in potato salads, but then they roast really well and they bake really well. They do pretty much a lot of those different things. But yeah, the lovely thing about Scotland is you get customers coming in saying, "Have you got any of these?" And I'm not eating that, Mark. And people really know their potatoes in Scotland. It's a really good thing.
Absolutely, I do like a mashed potato and some sort of dauphinoise or garlic potato. That would be my.
Yeah. But they're a great thing to eat, and yet they're we eat a lot less potatoes than we used to, and we've gone over to eating pasta, which is okay, it's fine, but it's quite a it's quite a strange thing in some ways, because we've taken wheat and we've rolled it out, and we've made it into flat strips, and then we've dried it out, and then we've cut it up, and then we put it back into water to get it back. And we eat rice, which and obviously rice growers need to make a living, but we don't produce rice here, and the impact of some rice production is pretty significant on the planet. So
really, what we should be doing is promoting the potato.
Well, I have to say, eating more potatoes would be good for the planet, and actually quite good for our health. There's lots of nutrients in the potato that it's been rubbish, the potato, I think, as well. It's just starch and it's not really a vegetable. But actually, especially if you keep the skin on, there's a lot of nutrients in the skin and just under the skin that are really useful, and it's got lots of good health properties, potato, I think.
Baked potato, Pete, what's your favourite filling?
Oh, no. Well, actually, I have to say, I am not a great... I know I should, really like my soya spreads and my sunflower spreads and all that, but I like butter. I do like butter, and actually, as long as it's got butter in it, I don't really care about the rest of it, I like baked beans. Cold baked beans is fine in potato. And
cold baked beans?
Well, cold, hot, I don't mind. I mean, baked beans, again, I know we don't grow the beans in Scotland, but you want a food which is, good for you, good for the planet. I think.
I'm still stuck on the idea of cold baked beans over.
Oh, God, wonderful! Yes,
straight
out, in my view, straight out of the tin. But I shouldn't say that on public.
I'd probably take the other side of that debate and heat my beans up, maybe with a bit of cheese on them, a cheesy beano.
I'm not against that. I'm not against that.
So Pete Ritchie, a man that has his beans anyway.
We just think baked beans are baked beans. They're not. We need a whole. We need to think about like a red wine, different baked beans, not just the same baked bean every day.
A baked bean connoisseur, as you will.
Yeah.
As much as I would love to spend the rest of the lesson talking about baked beans, I wanted to find out more about food waste and its role in food security. Dr. Borthwick was able to give us a little bit more information.
So food waste is a real issue, and it varies in economically less developed countries. It tends to be what we call pre-farm gate. So it's in the actual food production because of the lack of infrastructure or the lack of ability to control pests. So we're seeing in East Africa at the moment quite a significant rise in the amount of locust swarms, and that's having a massive impact on waste and loss in crops. And so not being able to control that pest is a real issue, or not being able to store your food on farm is an issue. But then when you get to richer economies, it's associated with the distribution of food and then the over purchasing of food that's then not used.
This seems like a good opportunity to stop and hear from Sean, who was born in Glasgow before eventually moving to London, where he set up a company whose goal is to solve that very problem of food wastage.
My name is Sean O'Keefe, and I'm the CEO and founder of Cogz. And what Cogz does is Cogz is an online marketplace that enables farmers and growers to sell their full crop. So any produce they can't sell or any produce they have surplus, they can sell that on our platform to food manufacturers and food processors.
I guess there must be a bit of a demand for that. There must be a lot of wastage.
Yeah, well, they estimate that it's about 30% or up to a third of all produce grown never actually leaves the farm gate, and that can be for a variety of reasons, because of the shape or size of it, just that it kind of doesn't meet the aesthetic or the grade to kind of be sold in supermarkets or wholesale. So a lot of this produce is just left over, and it's quite often not very financially viable for a farmer or grower to try and find a buyer for that produce. So lots of times it can end up as animal feed, or in a kind of good situation, anaerobic digestion, or kind of worst case scenario in landfill. And what we aim to do at Cogz is we see a world, our vision is where we see a world where everything grown gets eaten. So our kind of mission is to get that produce back into the food supply chain by any way, shape or means possible. So we want to get that produce into a position where it can extend the life of it, and it can be either turned into a product or at least end up on a plate. And that's kind of what we aim to do by connecting our farmers and growers up to manufacturers and processors. So an example of that might be something like an apple, for example, where that would usually end up in the supermarket, and we would kind of see our kind of very nice, round, kind of great sized apples in the supermarket. But what about those apples that don't look perfect or aren't exactly the right color? They don't have the kind of 30% green or the kind of 60% red or whatnot that you need. If they don't have that match, then sometimes it's very difficult for those farmers to find a home for that produce. And we actually started off testing our initial platform, so our online platform, with apples. And one of the reasons we did that is because in cold storage, apples can actually last. They can kind of survive in a really, really good state for up to 12 months. So that gave us an excellent opportunity to build up kind of both sides of our market, and to try and kind of give us more time to find a home for some of these apples. So they're kept in kind of very low oxygen, cold environments. So there's very little oxidation on the apples, which just means they last much, much longer.
I guess that means that the apples we buy in the supermarket, could have been picked from a tree 12 months before we take them home.
In theory, yes, it could do. The British supply chain is very much it very much relies on kind of immediate demand, but there's definitely cases where produce can be in warehouses for quite a long time. So it probably isn't unknown that you would have an apple that you would get in a supermarket that could have been picked quite some time before.
And we are a bit weird in the UK when we go to the supermarket and we buy fruit and veg, and we do have a thing that it all has to look a certain way and all be quite regimented in shape and size. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the fruit and veg that's a different size or looks slightly different, that there's anything wrong with that.
No, and that's totally true. And one of the things we look at Cogz is we look at the produce more as a kind of nutritional value. And it's not always the case that because produce looks the right way, it's actually the kind of most nutritious, or it's kind of got the best benefits to us as the kind of end consumers. So we tend to look at it more on kind of like what is the nutritional value that we can get out of the produce rather than is it the right colour, shape or size.
And taking the apples as an example, where could all the sort of misshaped apples, where could you end up selling them to?
So the types of people we end up selling apples to is, we've got lots of juice manufacturers, lots of smoothie manufacturers. We even have kind of food processors who will take bulk loads of apples. They'll turn them into apple juice. They'll make a blended apple juice, and then they'll sell that apple juice as your supermarket's own brand. So like your Tesco own brand apple juice or something like that, and that's where a lot of this produce goes into. So what we do is by juicing the apples and then selling on the ingredient, we increase the shelf life even longer. So that produce isn't going to waste and it's still got an opportunity to get back into the market. We also actually things like cider, we sell apples into the cider market as well. So they end up on your shelf in a different, or maybe your dad's shelf or your mum's shelf, something like that.
Pete went on to explain that this was common practice throughout agriculture and even impacts my favourite meal of the year.
Yeah, a lot of things. A lot of the fresh turkey we have at Christmas was killed in June, but has been sitting there at 0.5 degree ever since. So it's not frozen, but it's not. Wow. It's
since
not
June.
Entirely fresh. Yeah, just because we know how to, we know how to temperature control things now. We know how to humidity control things. So it was never frozen, but it hasn't just been plucked, because obviously, the old idea that you fatten the turkeys for Christmas because you've got spare grain in the autumn, and you can use the cattle sheds because the cattle aren't in yet, and that gets displaced by specialists who just grow turkey. And if you just grow turkey, you can't. If you try to only grow your turkeys and only use your sheds for Christmas, then that distorts what you can do. You're much better being able to use the turkey sheds all the year round. And if you've got extra turkey being sold at Christmas, you store them. All of these things are logical, as you specialize, that you come to do things in a certain way. But as I said before, for the planet and for society, everybody doing what's logical for them doesn't always work for the greater good. In terms of the energy loss, it's a really, really important part of the whole system because, as you know, we're still wasting one way or another about a third of the food that we produce in the world. And even if, you take your food waste and it gets picked up and it goes to an anaerobic digester somewhere, in terms of energy, we've lost 90% of the energy that went into making that food. What we get back in electricity at the end of that process is very small compared to all the energy that went into producing it. So cutting down food waste, is the lowest hanging fruit of the whole system.
And yet there's obviously some way to go in even doing that.
Yeah, it's a big challenge.
There are clearly many problems to be solved when it comes to feeding a growing human population in a sustainable way. Food production is of course dependent ultimately on photosynthesis, which we'll learn about more in another lesson. However, there is so much more going on in our food system, which creates a huge amount of opportunities for building a career and solving some of those challenges we face as a planet.
Food systems and ultimately food security, it's such a multi-dimensional topic that there are huge opportunities in terms of career paths. So if you're interested in biology, there's research in agricultural research looking at varieties that will be resilient to changing climates, looking at food safety. So that there's that sort of direct research area. There's, if you like, economics. It's, there's a whole range of food system economic opportunities. But then within industry as well, industry are really, really looking for people with skills and an understanding of the issues of food security. As I've mentioned a couple of times, industry plays a really, really important role. And our industry in the UK, supermarkets, supply chains, it's really sophisticated. So there are really interesting opportunities that are quite cutting edge in terms of how you can use big data, how you can use AI, robotics and things like that within food systems. And then also, if you're interested in working with communities, especially within vulnerable communities, there are opportunities. A lot of social enterprises and NGOs. One of the sort of the key aspects will be looking at food and food availability and feeding programs. So both within the UK, but also internationally. So there's a huge variety of opportunities. And I think that if you're taking sort of a range of science hires, so like me, if you're looking at biology, geography, those sorts of topics, then going into university in that area, or even looking at agricultural programs, which aren't tailored anymore to just produce farmers. You're learning about climate change, you're learning about soil science and all of these different things, and with a view to going into industry. I think there are really great options for the future. And as we've seen recently, it's a real political priority at the moment.
And of course, if any of those young people are interested in doing it, they'll be able to find obviously more about the courses that yourself and your colleagues run at Edinburgh University, I'm sure, online. And I'm sure you'll have inspired loads of them. We thoroughly appreciate your input.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk. I hope that I've shed a little bit of light onto this topic. There's so much more to talk about. And as you say, there's lots of information on the University of Edinburgh website. And I'd be more than happy to answer questions. You'll be able to find my contact details through the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Pete was also keen to highlight the importance of science in modern farming and the opportunities that lie within.
What we are seeing, of course, in Scotland and across the world is young farmers are coming into a sector. Maybe they're coming back to their farm after they've been away for a bit, or they're coming into farming as new entrants, and they're coming in with fantastic new ideas. I mean, they really are. They're coming in saying, this is not muck and magic. This is science. We've got a fantastic beef farmer, one of the groups we're working with, who's really into the science of what he's doing, and as well as being into the animal welfare of what he's doing. So there's a lot of science in the young farmers. There's a lot of people in a lot of the young farmers, and they've moved away, a lot of them, for just growing a thing, growing beef for the supermarkets, growing wheat for the grain traders. They're now starting to think, who's going to buy my food? How can I make my food something people want to buy? So that's really changed. And of course, in the pandemic, we've seen so many farms in Scotland basically open their gates and go, you know what? You need food. We've got food. We'll sell it to you. And that's been fantastic. And we want to see much more of that in Scotland. That it's more, you can go and buy local food, either direct from the farm or through farm shops or through independent retailers that are buying from the farm, so that we have a much closer connection between people and farms. That's really important. And farmers need to see themselves as, not just making stuff to sell to supermarkets, but as actually nourishing people.
We've obviously had some great contributions from Dr. Fiona Borthwick from Edinburgh University. We've had Sean from Cogz in London, and we've obviously had yourself, Pete, giving up your own time away from the farm today to help us talk through this key area. So I guess just a huge thank you for giving up your time and sharing your own experience and bringing to life what in reality is quite a small key area in the higher course. But of course, it is such a huge issue that affects all of us.
Great. Well, thanks very much for asking me, Paul. And if when things get better, your students want to come out and have a chat on the farm, they'd be very, very welcome.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to coming down and trying some of these baked beans.
All right. Yeah, we can have a tasting competition anytime you like.
Thanks again to Fiona, Pete and Sean. Fiona has also provided an interesting video presentation to support this key area further, and we'll put that up on our YouTube channel. Thanks also to you for listening. You can subscribe or follow the podcast on your favourite platform to ensure you don't miss the next lesson. Don't forget to follow up by reading through the topic notes and trying some past paper style questions. Lecky Scotland's Higher Biology for SQA 2019 and Beyond, Revision and Practice, offers 2 books in one, and you can find material for this lesson on pages 59 and 60. Thanks to Charlie for the intro music and to Education Scotland for their support.